badly needed on the ground.
Well, thank you, Senator. I appreciate that very much, and you're right.
Senator McCain.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Kerry, Secretary Kerry, I watched with great interest some of your comments, and may I say I think you're about to hit the trifecta. Geneva II was a total collapse, as I predicted to you that it would be. The only tangible result is that people who went to Geneva for the Free Syrian National Council, their relatives were kidnapped. The Israeli-Palestinian talks are, even though you may drag them out for a while, are finished. And I predict to you, even though we gave the Iranians the right to enrich, which is unbelievable, those talks will collapse too. You can talk about Mali and you can talk about other places in the world, but on the major issues, this administration is failing very badly. On the issue of Ukraine, my hero, Teddy Roosevelt, used to say, talk softly but carry a big stick. What you're doing is talking strongly and carrying a very small stick, in fact, a twig. What has been done so far as a result of the Russian dismemberment of Ukraine in violation of a treaty that they signed in return for the nuclear inventory of Ukraine, which was then the third largest nuclear power. Some individual sanctions, some diplomatic sanctions, suspension, not removal from the G8, and now more threats to come. I predicted that Putin would go into Crimea because he couldn't bear to give up Sevastopol, because he is what he is. And I am now very concerned because of our lack of response, whether he will foment discontent in the manner which he is now, which will then demand autonomy for parts of eastern Ukraine. And when the foreign minister of Russia lies to your face once, twice, 3, 4 times, I would be very reluctant to take his word for anything. So here we are with Ukraine being destabilized, part of it dismembered, and we won't give them defensive weapons. I take strong exception to Mr. Murphy's statement. We don't want to provoke Vladimir Putin by giving these people the ability to defend themselves after their country has been dismembered and there is provocations going on. That I say to you, sir, is the logic of appeasement. The logic of appeasement. I want to know, and I think the American people should know, and maybe most importantly, the people of Ukraine should know, why won't we give them some defensive weapons when they're facing another invasion, not the first, but another invasion of their country? It is just beyond logic. And frankly, when we don't give people assistance to defend themselves, then it, just as the Syrian decision, it reverberates throughout the entire world. I'd like to know why it is not at least under serious consideration to give them some defensive weapons with which to defend themselves.
Well, Senator, let me begin with the place that you began with your premature judgment about the failure of everything. I guess it's pretty easy to lob those judgments around, but particularly well before the verdict is in on any of them. Geneva II, my friend, I said will not succeed, maybe for a year or two. But if the truth is there's no military solution and there is only a political solution, you have to have some forum in which to achieve it. You know, the talks on Vietnam, you know this better than anybody, went on for how many years? Years. It took them a year to design the table to sit around. So I had no expectations that Assad's calculation was going to change in time for the first meeting or second meeting. But what we learned is that the Syrian regime was completely unwilling to negotiate in any serious way, which helps in terms of the opposition. And the opposition showed itself to be quite capable. And that was important. And 40 nations took it seriously enough, Senator, to come in order to make it clear you needed a political solution. Now, that's a beginning. That's all it is. I understand that. But if Syria is ever going to be resolved, it's going to be through a political process. And that political process, Geneva II, is now in place, though the moment is not ripe, because we still have to change Assad's calculation. And you know as well as I do, because you and I have talked about that, that that has yet to happen. It has to happen. Secondly, Israel-Palestine. It's interesting that you declare it dead, but the Israelis and the Palestinians don't declare it dead. They want to continue to negotiate.
We'll see, won't we, Mr. Secretary?
Beg your pardon?
We'll see.
Well, yeah, we will see, but why
It's
declare
stopped.
it dead
It is
today?
stopped. Recognize reality.
Okay. We'll see where the reality is as we go down the road here. There are serious problems. It's a tough issue. But your friend Teddy Roosevelt also said that the credit belongs to the people who are in the arena who are trying to get things done. And we're trying to get something done. That's a Teddy Roosevelt maxim, and I abide by it. I think it's important to do this. Sure, we may fail. And you want to dump it on me? I may fail. I don't care. It's worth doing. It's worth the effort. And the United States has a responsibility to lead, not always to find the pessimism and negativity that's so easily prevalent in the world today. And finally, on the subject that you raise about Iran, we're talking. The option is you can go to war. A lot of people are ready to drop bombs all the time. We can do that. We have the ability. But this president and this Secretary of State believe that the United States of America has a responsibility first to exhaust every diplomatic possibility to find out whether we could prove what the Iranians say, that their program is peaceful. And before you ask the American people to go to war, we have an obligation to exhaust the remedies that are available to us in order to legitimize whatever subsequent action we might have to take. Now, we are engaged in eyes-open negotiations. We have no illusions about how tough this is. I'm not predicting success, Senator. I'm not. But I know we have an obligation to go through this process before we decide to go to war. So that's where we are. You declare them all dead. I don't. And we'll see what the verdict is. With respect to arming and providing assistance to the Ukrainians, the fact is that we are currently working with Ukraine to determine their requirements across the entire security sector. And based on those requirements, we're going to review the options with the Congress and find out whether or not we're in a position to provide assistance. But let me tell you something. If we decided today to give them a whole bunch of assistance, you got to train them, you got to do things, which is the greater deterrent? We happen to believe right now that if the deterrence you're looking for is going to have an impact, the greatest deterrence will come from Putin's recognition of his own vulnerabilities in his economy and his recognition that if we bring sector sanctions, Russia is going to really hurt. I think that's a strong incentive, a strong deterrent, even as we consider what we do for the long term for military assistance, which will not make a difference fast enough to change this calculation.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time, but facts are stubborn things, as Ronald Reagan used to say. Geneva I, there were 50,000 dead. Geneva II, there was 100 and some thousand dead in Syria. Now there's 150,000 dead. Any objective observer will tell you that Bashar Assad is winning on the battlefield. From the time when the President of the United States said, it's not a matter of whether, it's a matter of when Bashar Assad is going to leave. Nobody says that anymore. And your view of what the Ukrainians need is vastly different from what the Ukrainians think they need, which is a sovereign right to try to defend themselves, which is something that we have done historically, helping people who are struggling against an overwhelming odds. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, John, if I can just say to you, I just said to you, we are evaluating with them exactly what their needs are. And we'll come back here and ask you if that's
They've said what they needed, what their needs are a long time ago, and you and I could sit down in 15 minutes and tell them, and knowing what their needs are, and that's defensive weapons.
I think you both made your
The
point.
greatest single need right now is to get their economy moving and to be economically strong, even because they won't survive otherwise.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
very much. Mr. Secretary, you talked about the Russian-led unrest in eastern Ukraine, and there's now been an announcement that they're going to try to have a referenda in Donetsk on May 11th in front of the presidential election on May 25th. And clearly the goal of that referenda is to say that that part of the country wishes to secede and go back to Russia. Could you talk a little bit about that as it is unfolding as a strategy, a referenda strategy in Russia, and what the administration is thinking about as a strategy to deal with that?
Well, thank you, Senator. The strategy, that may be the strategy, and if it is, it's very dangerous. And if they proceed down that road, that will be a second swing at a completely illegal, unconstitutional, internationally unsupportable effort to violate the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So nobody has any illusions about what might come with that. Now, that's the call for that, I believe, came from some paid individual in Donetsk, not necessarily an announcement per se that that's what's going to happen. And so I think it's unclear. There are representatives of the Ukrainian government who've gone out there to begin to negotiate the deoccupation of the buildings and the process forward. And I think it's sort of it's a moving target right now as to exactly what may or may not happen. But the issue is whether the Russians are serious in this discussion that we hope to have next week at resolving these kinds of questions. Part of their complaint right now is that there is an inadequate representation within the constitutional reform process in Ukraine. And they allege that if there is a proper representation and listening to people in the East and the South, that that's really what they're after. I don't know the answer to that. If this is camouflage for this other move, we're obviously going to watch extremely carefully, and the President is completely poised to move forward with the sector or other sanctions necessary to respond to this.
So is the EU and the United States working together in terms of pushing for a fair and democratic process in this election? And what concerns do you have about the Russians trying to interfere with this electoral process? And what role do you think we can play with the EU to make sure this next month up to May 25th
Well, the key is
unfolds?
the key is to flood the zone with observers, make sure we've got OSCE, we've asked UN, we're trying to get as many people in there who can be the truth tellers, the people who can inform as to exactly what is happening and allow less maneuverability for the pretexts and the contrived situations to try to provide a legitimacy. And I think that's one important thing. The second is to work with the Ukrainians themselves to make sure that all of the instruments for a legitimate, open, free, fair, accountable, accessible election are available.
And I'd like, while you're here, just to add one more subject, and that is climate change. It is worsening. The IPCC report actually has shown a telescope timeframe for the dangers that the planet is facing. Could you talk a little bit about that as you see this impact globally?
Well, Senator, I appreciate your asking the question. The impacts of climate change are growing enormously, not significantly, but just enormously, at a pace where you know, Senator, very well, because you've followed this for years and been a leader on it. All of the scientific analysis that suggested targets for that we need to meet in order to hold the carbon levels such that we can hold the warming of the earth at 2 degrees centigrade, we're in excess of them. We're moving beyond them. And we're moving beyond them at a pace that shows us bringing more coal-fired power plants online, more methane being released, which is 20 times more potent than carbon, which is the consequence of the warming that's already taking place, more carbon dioxide going into the oceans, which is changing the ecosystem, more fires, more floods, more different weather patterns. I mean, there's just a profoundly impactful, clear, scientifically proven pattern taking place. And all of the predictions of the scientists are not just being met, they're being exceeded, both in the rapidity with which it's happening and the level to which it is happening. So given the most recent IPCC report by the UN Climate Panel, really we've got to respond, and we've got to respond rapidly. The margin for error is disappearing. And when I hear people, say to me, well, some people still contest the evidence, or they contest the science, without any science to contest it, by the way, but they contest it nevertheless. And they say, well, why should we take these measures? What if you guys are wrong? Well, as you know, Senator, better than anybody, if what you're proposing or countless governments across the world are starting to do is wrong, the worst that can happen is they've made themselves more energy independent, they've got cleaner energy, there's less carbon dioxide, less particulates in the air, people are healthier, there are more jobs created in the realm of new energy, alternative energy, renewable energy, all for the better. If the other guys are wrong, the people saying don't listen to it, what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is life as you know it on Earth is over. And so I think people in public life have a responsibility to employ the precautionary principle that when you're weighing various concepts and they're supported by science and fact and empirical evidence, there's a responsibility to take action, and I hope we will.
And thank you for your work on that issue, Mr. Secretary, and all the other issues that we've been discussing here today. These are tough issues.
Thank you, Senator.
But they
Appreciate
have to be resolved. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. As I call upon Senator Paul, let me say that Kentucky played a really tough, defensive, exciting game, and we appreciate them showing the nation what Kentucky's all about.
I know your consolation is sincere, and I wish I could accept it with a better attitude, but I'm still unhappy with the outcome. Thank you, Secretary Kerry, for coming today. One of the first things or actions that I remember as you began your office was that you reinstated the 4 employees, that were involved and implicated by the review board in Benghazi. It's always, to me, been more of a concern about the decisions that were made in the 6 months in advance of Benghazi than the talking points. In fact, I think the talking points have drowned out some really important decisions we made. And we're all human, so these people I'm not saying are bad people, but some really bad decisions were made in the 6 months leading up. 2 of the big ones that were made, I think, were that there was a 16-person security team led by Colonel Wood who said we wanted to stay in country, and they were not allowed to stay in country. And there was also the request for a plane. And apparently that evening, for a DC-3 that was denied earlier, maybe about 6 months before the attack, that a plane would have been important. There was a struggle that evening, to get permission from the Libyans to get a plane. I think the C-30 they were trying to get on was a Libyan plane. So there really, I think, were some bad decisions made. And this doesn't make the people who made the decisions bad people, but they were bad decisions that were made. There were requests for security that were turned down. Throughout the 6 months preceding the attack on Benghazi, though, a lot of money was spent on things that I think most Americans would say are frivolous and maybe not part of the immediate mission of the State Department. I'll give you a few examples. $100,000 was spent on sending comedians to India. It was the Make Chai Not War tour. $100,000 was spent getting electrical charging station in Vienna for the ambassador so he could green up the embassy. $650,000 was spent on Facebook ads. These are all State Department expenses. $700,000 was spent on landscaping for the embassy in Brussels. $5 million was spent on crystal wine glasses and crystal glassware, barware for the State Department, for embassies. You can argue the legitimacy of these, but it's hard to argue that in the face of the disaster in Benghazi, and it's hard to argue this in the face of people who say, well, we didn't have enough money. The other criticism I think that ought to be considered with regard to Benghazi is that, and this is something I think the review board didn't adequately address, is whether or not in the midst of a country coming out of war that really the State Department should be in charge of security, whether they can adequately provide security. And I think one of the biggest mistakes in decision, these all happen, from your predecessor, not you, but the biggest decision mistake, I think, in Benghazi was thinking that Benghazi was more like Paris than Baghdad. And had we treated Benghazi as a fortress in the middle of a military base, I think we might have had a better chance. Nobody can predict exactly, what could happen with different outcome. But I think when we have a civil war raging, we have to consider whether or not one of the errors in decision was how we chose to protect or not protect the consulate. Why is this still important? I think it's still important because I'm concerned another attack could happen like this in other countries that are under State Department control. I know you're probably well aware of sort of the situation on the ground in Libya, but I don't know that it's perfectly stable. I'm concerned whether or not we could have another attack of this magnitude in Tripoli, at the embassy. I guess we no longer have any consulate in Benghazi, correct?
We didn't have one then, Senator.
Okay.
It was not a consulate.
Okay, we had some kind of
It was not a
office.
consulate.
Okay, but anyway, my concern is whether or not we're adequately protected, whether the State Department can adequately protect, and whether or not maybe embassies in war-torn countries or countries emerging from civil war would be better off treated more as we did the embassy in Baghdad, with a much greater military presence and a much greater military oversight of protection, and whether or not you've looked at the expenses, and if you haven't, you'll look at some of these expenses that many of us have seen in the press and are aghast that we spent $100,000 sending some comedians to India, $650,000 on Facebook ads, $700,000 on landscaping, $5 million on crystalware, that really, in the face of the Benghazi disaster, we need to reevaluate how we're spending our money at the State Department.
When did the comedians go to India? I'm curious.
I think it's all previous to your tenure. I'm not blaming this on you, but it's
we could
something.
use a few right now.
What's that? Yeah. No, I mean, I don't want to be frivolous
curious
about
about that. I
sending
didn't know
some
that.
comedians. I mean, really, seriously,
Well,
when
look, let
there's
me-
complaints
let
we
me-
don't have enough money for security.
Senator, let me answer your question. Good question. It's legitimate. But let me dispel you of any. I keep hearing repeated again and again that there was, quote, no accountability for these people who were involved. Two of them were forced to retire. They retired, and the other two were essentially demoted and took on lesser responsibilities. That's pretty heavy stuff for career people. So this needs to end, this notion that there was no accountability. Not just the lives were changed or the lives lost and the people who were part of that, but these people, obviously paid a price, and a significant one. In addition to that, we've gone beyond what the ARB required in the 29 requirements. We've done even more with respect to our embassies. Every week, every meeting that we have every day, as a matter of fact, we start the morning with an 8:30 meeting. If I'm here, I'm there. If I'm not, I'm informed. But we have a review of our threat levels, and we have too many places where there are threats. We've done an incredible job under the hardest of circumstances, hardening sites where they can be, taking unbelievable precautions for our people. And we've done a lot of different things. We've created a new Deputy Assistant Secretary for high threat posts, who's responsible for making sure they get the focused attention necessary to keep people safe. We've ensured that the staff of diplomatic security go to regular bureau meetings and regional meetings and communicating on security issues. We've adjusted work requirements. Because, I mean, I'm not going to go through all of it. We've got 151 new security personnel. We've got countless Marine detachments slowly going out to provide protection where we can. And all of this has budget implications, obviously. I will certainly, I'm puzzled by some of these expenses. I'm going to look at them, and I'll investigate it. But, I think that there's an incredible effort underway at the State Department to both tighten the belt, but also upgrade our capacity to provide security to all of our people. And it's a paramount responsibility of mine and the department.
Do you think it was a mistake to have the ambassador in Benghazi without more significant military protection?
Let me speak to there was a request put in for additional security for Ambassador Stevens. and it was given to him. He had additional numbers of people that went out there with him. The problem is it wasn't adequate, obviously.
Well, and quite a bit of it was sort of unofficial militia. I mean, do you think it was a good decision to have unofficial militia who basically ran when the time came, or whether
He
we should have
he
more
actually
Marines?
had additional security personnel, official within the department. There was an additional, I think it was 1 or 2 people who were assigned. So his number, when he went out there, met what he had requested in terms of official State Department personnel. But obviously, it was not adequate, as we all have sadly learned, to the task of repelling what took place. But the intelligence community has said they had no information about that kind of attack. There was nothing operative on which to be able to make a decision.
Are we still using militias, or do we have more of our own people doing protection?
We have more of our own people. We have significantly hardened up the embassy there. We have I'm not going to go into the numbers, but we have a very significant increase in American personnel on the ground. We have much more significant emergency contingency plans, and we are working very, very hard with other countries to work on the overall security issue. I was just in Algeria and Morocco for the security dialogue in the last few days of last week, and we discussed specifically the training of personnel for a rapid response force in Libya and the ability to be able to provide greater training and capacity going forward. I think everybody is concerned about Libya and the current status.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, we're almost at the end here. I know that Senator Corker has a few comments to make, and then I'll close out, and we'll get you back to the challenges that we all collectively face.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I would like to ask permission that the testimony on September the 3rd be entered into the record, especially as we've highlighted. It tells a very different story about why the administration was asking for the military strike, the limited military strike that the Secretary alluded to. It's a very different story then than the story that is now being told by the administration. And Mr. Secretary, I want to say that I know the issues in Syria are very difficult, and I look forward to this detailed briefing we'll have soon. One of many that's been promised that hasn't occurred. And I don't think there are easy solutions there. I do think that from a bipartisan standpoint, people are very concerned right now about U.S. credibility, and Syria, I think, was the beginning of that. I think there are concerns about Ukraine, our actual willingness to go forward and do something after we lost so much credibility around the red line issue, and so much credibility on the ground with just people in the neighborhood regarding not following through on commitments that were made, and I know that you know they were made. So, look, I hope the chapter is not written, and I hope we have successes. I think everybody on this committee wants our foreign policy to be successful, and I think under Chairman Menendez's leadership, we've operated in a very bipartisan way. But I will say to you that if things don't change, you in effect could be presiding over a period of time where more U.S. credibility is lost than anyone could have imagined, and a time when the world is becoming less safe as a result. So I wish you well. I really do. I'm very genuine in my thoughts that I'm glad you're in a position to try to affect these things, and have said that over and over again, but I will tell you, I think there's genuine concern here about where we are on both sides of the aisle. I think you sense that today, and I do hope that somehow the people that we're dealing with get a sense that we're really willing to do the things that are necessary to deter. And I hope the President will soon, we had a good conversation a few weeks ago, look at sectoral sanctions if we end up having the troops on the border there much longer. It seems to me that would be a good place to start. But again, a lot of concerns. I thank you for your work, and I hope things turn around, because I do believe that right now our foreign policy efforts are not yielding the kind of results that you'd like to see, nor we'd like to see, and yet we all want them to be successful.
Well, Senator, if I can comment, having spent 29 years on this committee, started way over there in that far end seat and worked my way up to where Senator Menendez is, So I've seen the ups and downs. I've seen the merry-go-round and the roller coaster of American foreign policy up close and personal. And I will tell you that we're living in a different time. I know the expectations are very high, but at the end of World War II, there was only one country standing, so to speak, and we were magnanimous enough to rebuild Germany and Japan, and people opposed it, many people. Truman had the courage with Marshall to make it happen. The fact is that we could make mistakes, either in policy choices or in economy, and still win. And we did for a long time. And ultimately, in 1990, 91, things changed with the Soviet Union. And that released an enormous amount of pressure. A place like, what was then Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic and Slovak, unleashed all kinds of forces everywhere. And so today we're living with a far more almost 19th century, 18th century diplomatic playing field where interests and some cases mercantilist interests, in other cases just security interests or territorial interests, other kinds of things, are raising their head in ways that they didn't during the Cold War because they were suppressed. And now, with the rise of radical Islam and massive numbers of young people who are filled with aspirations because they're in touch with everybody in the world through the media, the social media, they know what's happening everywhere. I mean, if you look at what happened in Tunisia, it was a fruit vendor who was tired of being slapped around and by the police and the corruption in the country, and so he self-immolated, and that ignited a revolution, and a dictator of 30 years left in Tahrir Square. That wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood. It wasn't religiously driven. It was young people looking for a future. Syria, the same thing. Young people were looking for a future, and when their parents came out to protest the way they were put down, Assad started shooting them. And that has brought us to where we are today. You know, the United States has power, enormous power. But we can't necessarily always dictate every outcome the way we want, particularly in this world where you have rising economic powers. China, India, Mexico, Korea, Brazil, many other people who are players. 11 of the 15 people who used to receive aid from IMF are now donor countries. We're living in a changed world. And governance is not doing very well in many places. Might I add, also here, regrettably. So we need to do, all of us, a job of looking into the future and trying to figure out how we're going to stand up for America's interests and promote them more effectively. And that includes in the budget for foreign policy and in the options that we can put on the table. Now, one final word, if you'll permit me. On Syria, where we hear this notion that somehow there was a red line and then it wasn't enforced, and somehow, it's a sign of weakness. I beg to differ. Facts are stubborn things. The President of the United States made his decision. He said, I am going to use military force. But he listened to people on the Hill who said, if you're going to do that, you ought to come to Congress. Now, maybe some of them were, there were some crocodile tears in that particular plea, because when he came to the Congress to accede to the constitutional process of our country and get them to affirm his prerogative to do what he decided to do, there was a resounding reluctance, and you fought it. This committee was the sole exception. We know what the Senate floor might have done, and we know what the House would have done. So the President made his decision to use force. But out of my discussions with Lavrov, and might I add President Obama's discussions with Putin at the summit that they had, They talked about an alternative way of doing it without use of force. And so we came to an agreement to remove all of the weapons, not just to degrade some of his capacity over 1 or 2 days or whatever it was going to be. Now, that would have had an impact, yes, on people's thinking, but it would not have changed the fundamental course, I believe, of what was going to happen. Might have had an impact, though. But I have to tell you, the president made his decision, and he was ready to use force. And we actually came up with a better solution, which is get all of the weapons out, all of them out. And that still leaves us with other options, folks. So I don't think we should, I think we need to depoliticize this a little bit and try to find a way forward for us to...
Yeah, I don't think when you have bipartisan concern that anybody is politicized, and I take tremendous offense at you making a comment that I have concerns has some kind of political implications when both sides of the aisle have expressed concerns. But let me just say,
No, when I say
well, let me finish.
Senator, I'm not directing that at you personally.
Okay.
When I say depoliticize, I mean this whole notion that, I think there's a politics involved in this notion that we're not, pressing in enough places on enough things. And I just think that the United States' interests are better served by us trying to find the common ground to move forward on these things, rather than falling prey to some of these, I think, sort of stereotypes.
I don't think the president made the kind of effort that most presidents would make in shaping opinion within Congress, but we'll let that go. And I'll just say in general, I can't imagine that you would feel differently that our move to work with Russia in the way that we did has certainly changed the dynamics in many places. And certainly Iran has been the beneficiary of that. Russia has been the beneficiary of that. We have created an air of permissiveness, there's no question. And I don't see how you can debate that. I mean, that's scholars on both sides of the aisle understand that to be the fact, and facts are hard to overcome. So look, you've got a tough hand. You've been dealt a tough hand. And I don't know what kind of support you get or not support you get from the White House, but we wish you well. We want to be successful and in our foreign policy. But right now, I will say, I think the steps that we took in Syria have affected us in Iran. They've affected us in the peninsula. They've affected us in Ukraine. China's watching us. It's affected us there. And I hope that somehow during the remainder of your tenure, you're able to turn around our foreign policy in such a way that the statements that have been made are not true, but that we have some successes, because I think all of us are very concerned.
Well, Senator, look, you've been a terrific help in keeping this committee working with the chairman and cooperating in so many different ways. And I thank you for that, and I know this comes from a genuine concern. I'm not suggesting otherwise, I promise you. But I would say to you that I think that I think Russia, with all due respect, is not acting out of strength. I do not believe that Russia has particularly helped itself. Have they accomplished a goal to protect Sevastopol for the time being and to, quote, secure Crimea, at least, in a military concept, if not legitimately in international law? Yeah. But at great cost. At great cost. And over time, if you look at Russia's economy, there are real challenges. They are running the risk, clearly, of isolating themselves further and of losing friends around the world. They've already lost them in Ukraine, where people who were once more supportive now feel threatened and, frankly, abused by what has happened. And if Russia were to come in, I tell you, Ukrainians, I believe, will fight over the long term. That will not be a pretty picture, and I suspect that President Putin understands that. So this is not a hand of strength. And I think we need to, all of us, stay focused on a strategy, on a long-term strategy, and recognize that Russia also has far closer ties to Ukraine and far greater interests, other than our interest in democracy and freedom, which are huge. But in terms of history, that's where Russian religion comes from. That's where Russian wars of liberation were fought. And they have interests that they are trying to assert, I think in the wrong way, but we have to obviously counter that, and we are. So my hope is that, you know, we can write a better chapter going forward, but I'm not sitting here telling you naively that that's automatically going to happen.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you that Russia has tremendous weaknesses. And I think our hopes are on this committee that their move into Crimea ends up being one of the biggest geopolitical mistakes they could possibly have made. I think our concern is, will the administration carry out policies to ensure that that's the case? And I think that's what you're
I think
hearing
you heard
today.
me pretty clearly today, and I do not doubt this president's resolve one iota. He is clearly going to, he will continue. He has in the last weeks been conversing with all of the leaders personally on the telephone, building the support for this current level of sanctions and for what has yet to come. And we hope it won't have to come, because I think that's a challenge for all, but it's something we're ready to effect if we need to.
I've listened with interest to the dialogue between you and Senator Corcoran. Since I gathered the desire to engage in such a dialogue, I let it go on for a while, and I appreciate that. I have one final question and then a closing comment. Mr. Secretary, I said at the very beginning of this hearing that the one part of the budget that most worries me is the Western Hemisphere. Year after year after year after year, we have seen cuts to the hemisphere, even though it is our own front yard. We, in doing so, I think, undermine taking advantage of the economic opportunities, underestimate the security challenges stemming from international criminal organizations, and do not do enough to promote development, educational exchanges, and the consolidation of democracy and the rule of law. And when I look at Central America and the crime rate, I see what's happening in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia. I see the challenges in Argentina, and I say to myself, there is an enormous agenda here to pursue. So would you commit to working with me to figure out how we can better position the Western Hemisphere in our budgetary priorities here?
I'd be delighted to, Senator. Some of the change is a reflection of shifting circumstances, like Colombia is much more capable today and is doing things it wasn't able to do
I
before.
recognize in Colombia and Mexico, that's a fact. The problem is
But also
that
we
we don't reinvest that money back in the hemisphere. We send it somewhere else.
That's a fair comment. That's true. There are choices that have been made in the overall budget allocation process. There are other places where, like, for instance, in Haiti, there are some reductions, but that's a reflection of money in the pipeline. When the money in the pipeline gets used, we will be right back here asking for the same level or more. So there are challenges, and nobody knows it better than you do, and we're happy to sit down and work with you.
Well, let me close the hearing by just making an observation. I think, as you well know, Mr. Secretary, from your service here, that the members who choose to serve on this committee are passionate about the views that they have, as has been expressed here today from a wide range. And these views, I think, generally are held in very principled positions. We may not always agree as to them, but they are held in very principled positions. But I would hate for the hearing to end without putting that in context. This committee, on a bipartisan basis, has passed virtually every nomination that the administration has sent us, from the secretary all the way on down, in a timely basis. What happens on the floor is another challenge, but on a timely basis, overwhelmingly. This committee took one of the most significant steps that any member of the Senate could ever take, which is to vote in a bipartisan way for the authorization for the use of force in Syria, which I think we all acknowledge was critical for the president to get Russia to change Assad's calculation on the use of chemical weapons. This committee, in the aftermath of Benghazi, passed in a bipartisan way embassy security legislation. This committee passed OAS reform, PEPFAR reauthorization, previous Iran sanctions that have been vigorously pursued by the administration, and most recently legislation on Ukraine. So even though there are very passionate views here, in a very strong, in a midst of partisanship on the floor, I'm happy to say that we have had a wide breadth of bipartisanship in the committee on the critical issues of the day, working with the administration. And so let me close by saying I have one disagreement with my colleague who said that our foreign policy is spinning out of control. We are facing some of the most intractable challenges, and you, Mr. Secretary of the Administration, have sought to go after some of the most intractable challenges that others could have just simply walked away from. And instead of walking away from them, you sought to try to change the course of events for the better. And so from the chairman, I want you to know that I have every confidence in your intellect, in your tenacity, in your capacity to try to meet these challenges. That does not mean we will be successful every time, nor does it mean that we will necessarily agree every time on how to get there, although generally we always agree on what we want to get to. So with the gratitude of the committee for your service and for the time you spent with us here today, I'm going to leave the record open until the close of business on Thursday, and the hearing is adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, could I just say, you know what a fan I am of this committee, and I appreciate enormously the bipartisan efforts. I really do. Thank you.